Allow me to welcome to meeting number 5 of the Subcommittee on International Human Rights. Today, we will be starting our study of human rights in repressive states. In other words, we're examining the situation of human rights defenders, journalists, and media organizations. I will give a quick reminder to all those present in the room to please follow the recommendations from public health authorities, as well as the directives of the Board of the Internal Economy to remain healthy and safe. In other words, I'd like everyone present to maintain their masks, unless, of course, they are eating or speaking. Now, I'd like to welcome our first panel of witnesses. We are very, very pleased to have with us today from Human Rights Watch, we have Ms. Farida Deef, the Canadian Director of Human Rights Watch, and also from the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights, we're very pleased to have Mr. Yona Diamond, who is legal counsel at the center. Each of you will have 5 minutes for opening statement, and I'll begin with Ms. Deef of Human Rights Watch. Thank you, Ms. Deef. We will now commence with your opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson and honorable members of Parliament for inviting me to appear before this committee to discuss the challenges facing human rights defenders, journalists, and media organizations around the world. I'll focus my remarks tonight on specific countries of concern, highlighting patterns in terms of the methods and tools being used to silence independent voices. A key goal of repressive states is to erode the checks and balances on their authority. They all read from the same playbook and inevitably attack any restraints on their power, such as independent journalists, judges, politicians, and human rights defenders. How do they do this? By arresting journalists under the guise of publishing fake news, by branding peaceful dissent as terrorism to bring criminal charges against human rights defenders, by smearing civil society organizations as foreign agents, and by issuing arrest warrants and imposing punitive travel bans and asset freezes on anyone questioning their authority. These states also seize opportunities like the COVID-19 pandemic to further consolidate their power. As infections and deaths surge, some repressive leaders threatened, silenced, or even imprisoned anyone, including healthcare workers, who criticized their failed response. These states also use commercial spyware, a powerful tool to monitor and silence anyone who exposes their abuses. Governments have used the spyware Pegasus, developed by the Israel-based company NSO Group, to hack devices of journalists, opposition figures, and activists in 45 countries, including a staff member at my organization, Human Rights Watch. This company has been allowed to operate with impunity in the face of overwhelming evidence of abuse. I'll begin with a few crisis settings of particular concern, namely Afghanistan, Ethiopia, and Venezuela. In Afghanistan, after the Taliban takeover in August, they immediately rolled back women's rights and media freedom. The Taliban beat and detained journalists, and nearly 70% of all Afghan media outlets closed, and others were operating under threat and self-censoring. In Ethiopia, journalists reporting on the Tigray conflict faced intimidation, expulsion, and arrest. Last year, Ethiopian authorities temporarily suspended the Addis Standard, a leading news outlet in Ethiopia, claiming it was advancing the agenda of the Tigray People's Liberation Front. While in Venezuela, the Maduro government has carried out campaigns of stigmatization, harassment, and repression against the media. In May of last year, authorities seized the headquarters of newspaper El Nacional in an apparent effort to silence one of the few remaining independent media outlets in the country. We are also seeing worrying trends in countries that are traditional allies of Canada, including the United Arab Emirates, Israel, and India. In the United Arab Emirates, scores of activists, academics, and lawyers are serving lengthy sentences following unfair trials on vague and broad charges. The UAE also continues to develop its surveillance capabilities, misusing spyware to gain access to the private and encrypted communications of journalists, activists, and world leaders. While in Israel, authorities have targeted Palestinians for opposing the occupation, jailing thousands, and shutting down dozens of media outlets. Last year, Israeli authorities designated 6 prominent Palestinian civil society organizations as terrorist and illegal organizations, a move that permits closing their offices, seizing their assets, and jailing their staff and supporters. And finally, in India, critics of the BJP-led government, including activists, journalists, peaceful protesters, and even poets and actors, increasingly risk politically motivated harassment, prosecutions, and tax raids. Last year, the government restricted funding for 10 international NGOs working on climate change, the environment, and child labor. In closing, we ask this committee to urge the government to take several concrete steps to address these growing challenges. The government should condemn any state, including Canada's allies, that seeks to silence independent voices and limit the rights of journalists and human rights defenders to free assembly, association, and expression. To protect these at-risk groups, there's also an urgent need to regulate the global trade in surveillance technology. Canada could be a leader in the space and should ban the sale, export, transfer, and use of surveillance technology until human rights safeguards are put in place. Canada should also impose sanctions on commercial spyware companies that are responsible for or complicit in serious human rights abuses by repressive states until they can demonstrate a change of policy that will end the violations that gave rise to these sanctions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Deef. Now we will turn to the Raoul Wallenberg Center. Mr. Diamond, you have 5 minutes for your opening statement.
Thank you, Chair, and members of the subcommittee. I hope for a day when no one in the world is imprisoned for their thoughts and for having such a beautiful demand as freedom. This modest expectation was expressed by the celebrated Iranian poet-filmmaker Bakhtash Abtin before he was sent to prison on a 6-year term with his colleagues from the Iranian Writers Association. Shortly after, Bakhtash contracted COVID-19 in prison. As his condition deteriorated, authorities refused to send him to the hospital until it was too late. He died on January 8th of this year in state custody. Bakhtash Abtin's death is a stark reminder of the lethal risks human rights defenders face, especially during a pandemic in overcrowded, unhygienic, and undersupplied prisons. Nasrin Sotoudeh, the embodiment of the human rights movement in Iran, was sentenced to 38 years and 148 lashes in 2019 for her support of women's rights activists, including sharing pins and flowers. At the height of the pandemic, her near-fatal 46-day hunger strike, anchored in a public appeal for the release of political prisoners, mobilized unprecedented international attention and allyship. As a result, she is now able to recover at home on conditional release, though with difficulty breathing. Canadian-Iranian citizen Dr. Reza Eslami, a human rights law professor who has studied and taught here in Canada, was sentenced last year to 7 years in prison for attending a training course abroad, part of a well-known pattern targeting dual nationals in Iran. The Swedish Eritrean journalist Dawit Isaak and his colleagues remain the longest imprisoned journalists in the world in a country ranking at the bottom of the World Press Freedom Index for more than a decade. Canada must also prioritize the case of Canadian citizen Hussein Shalil, whose imprisonment goes back to 2006 and who faces a virtual life sentence in the Uyghur region, all for his peaceful advocacy for his community, emblematic of the horrors facing the Uyghurs as a group, including genocide. Dr. Wang Bingzong, founder of the Overseas Chinese Democracy Movement and first Chinese national to obtain his PhD in North America at McGill University, was kidnapped in 2002 and sentenced to life in solitary confinement after a half-day trial. His Canadian family has been advocating for his release ever since. Senator Leila de Lima has been unjustly detained for over 5 years for her courageous work to end the culture of impunity in the Philippines for the atrocities of Duterte's drug war, which has summarily killed tens of thousands, amounting to crimes against humanity. And yet, Senator de Lima remains one of the most productive and popular legislators in the Philippines, now running for re-election in the May elections, with the future of Philippine democracy on the ballot. In Russia, Anastasia Shevchenko's case represents the internal escalating crackdown in recent years. She was the first Russian criminally tried under the undesirable law, one of the Kremlin's key repressive tools, carrying up to 6 years in prison for human rights activity, all for holding a sign at a peaceful gathering stating "enough." These are just some of the emblematic cases which we've advocated for. At the same time, Indigenous rights defenders are being killed and are arrested for their activism around the world, including those at the forefront of our collective struggle to protect our environment. Last year alone, a global initiative documented at least 358 murders of human rights defenders, the most conservative number. I want to commend Canada for recently announcing the special refugee stream for human rights defenders at risk and launching the Declaration Against Arbitrary Detention in State-to-State Relations. But these cannot remain declarations. They must be acted upon with urgency and consistency across all global crises. Consular assistance for Canadians abroad is not a matter of discretion, but of international legal obligation, and legislation should further be adopted to this end. The Magnitsky Act is another invaluable tool in this regard, specifically worded to protect those rights defenders under consideration today and should be applied as such. The government should work to strengthen the implementation of the Magnitsky Law, including a robust and accessible system that engages with civil society. In our work, we have seen how advocacy can empower and help secure the release of rights defenders under or the medical care they need to survive. As parliamentarians, your actions carry additional influence, not only for the defenders themselves, but for the movements they represent and lives they protect. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Diamond. Now we'll open the floor to questions by the members. Each member has 7 minutes. We will start with Mr. Zuberi.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today, taking the time to be with us. I'd like to start off with Mr. Diamond. You mentioned around Hussein Jalil, the case of Hussein Jalil, and we've heard before from Erwin Kotler, who is with your center. Can you briefly, are you aware of the case of Idris Hassan, who's being held right now in Morocco?
I'm somewhat familiar.
Somewhat familiar, okay. Thank you. I was just going to ask you around that, but in terms of just very briefly, Hussein Jalil, if there's one recommendation you have for us, what would it be?
I would say to continue pushing, as the subcommittee has recommended previously, for a special envoy specifically designated not only to secure the release of Hussein Jalil, but other Canadian citizens who have long been locked up abroad for advocacy, particularly.
Thank you for that. I'd like to turn to Ms. Daif. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. Thank you for being here, and I'd like to ask you, you touched upon what's happening in India, the situation there. I'd like to give you some time to actually expand upon that.
Sure. Thank you so much. So we are seeing really worrying trends in India. I mean, the world's largest democracy, but certainly really dramatic backslide in human rights. We've documented certainly, with the BJP kind of government, with support by Hindu nationalists, attacks against religious minorities, certainly attacks against farm workers. President, the Prime Minister Modi called, protesters, peaceful protesters last year, parasites. And so certainly this is the type of language that we would see in very repressive states. We wouldn't really assume that would happen in a country that claims to be a democracy. And so there's been a real escalation in the human rights crisis in India. And we're seeing really worrying trends in terms of, stifling of media, targeting of journalists, using legislation around foreign funding of NGOs to close civil society organizations. And so there's been a real shrinking of the democratic space in India. There's been a shrinking of the civil society space, and it's incredibly worrying. And I think it really requires governments to take action to condemn this and condemn, even small steps, because I think what happens oftentimes is when allies, deteriorate at this rate in terms of their human rights, it's usually because a number of small steps that have been taken in a negative direction are ignored. When states turn a blind eye again and again and again to, small elements of repression, you see that there's a very worrying trend in which, a government like the Modi government feels as though they can take action with absolute impunity against minorities, against religious minorities, against, civil society in India. And then at some point it becomes quite difficult to turn the ship back around.
Thank you. And are there any recent examples that come to mind very briefly that you can expand upon?
Sure. I mean, definitely. I'm sure members of the committee know of the kind of worrying trends around religious garb and limitations around the wearing of the hijab by Muslim minorities in Karnataka and in southern India. Certainly a number of, wide-scale cases in which the Indian government has used, kind of politically motivated tax fraud allegations to really kind of target anyone who is, independently voicing their concerns about the human rights abuses in the country. And so it's certainly a worrying trend that we're seeing, and a number of examples are coming to mind every day. And certainly the statement by Prime Minister Modi of farm workers at the time, he was talking about the farm worker protests, which was a largely peaceful protest by farm workers, calling them parasites, I think is something that kind of is emblematic of a general approach that the Modi government has towards anyone voicing a dissenting opinion on their policies.
Thank you, Ms. Daif. And I'd like to shift focus for a moment. You talked about 6 groups in the Middle East. I don't want to take up too much time around that, but I would like to hear more from you around that particular point, if you may.
On the Palestinian organizations?
Yes.
That were,
exactly.
Okay, yes. So, I mean, as I said earlier, we see a really worrying trend by governments to use counterterrorism legislation, to misuse counterterrorism legislation to prosecute individuals and human rights defenders for their activities. And so as long as you can kind of frame them as a national security threat, then it allows you to really undermine their work and threaten their work. And we're seeing this in a number of countries around the world. And we've seen this recently in Israel as well, where you have, 6 Palestinian civil society organizations, some of the leading human rights organizations in the country that are documenting abuses by the Israeli government, that are working towards accountability at the International Criminal Court for war crimes that that are committed in the Palestinian territories. We've seen an attempt by the Israeli authorities to really muzzle their work, to limit their activities by imposing sort of baseless charges around counterterrorism on their actions. And what's been even more disconcerting or equally disconcerting for me has been the unfortunate silence by this government about these abuses. We've seen a number of Western states who have condemned the actions of the Israeli authorities in listing these organizations as terrorist, using those baseless charges. But unfortunately, we saw a complete silence on the part of Global Affairs Canada and a part of this government. There was no condemnation of those abuses. And I think what happens is once Canada turns a blind eye to abuses by its allies, it only exasperates the situation. It worsens the human rights crisis in a country, and it sends a signal to other states that those actions are condonable and fine to move forward.
Ms. Stephen, that's the limit of my time. I was hoping to talk more about surveillance in Canada and also about what's happening in Russia with respect to human rights defenders there. But hopefully we'll hear more from you about that later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Zuberi. We now turn to Mr. Cooper. You have 7 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses. I'm going to direct my questions to Ms. Deef. In your testimony, you cited a number of countries of concern, and I want to ask you a little more about Venezuela. You noted that the assets of the daily newspaper El Nacional were seized by the Maduro regime. Prior to that, Roland Carreno, a reporter with El Nacional and critic of the Maduro regime, was arrested in October 2020 on trumped-up charges of money laundering, financial terrorism, and illegal trafficking of weapons, and remains a prisoner of the Maduro regime. Are you familiar with this case, and if so, could you speak to it, and perhaps speak to it as part of a broader picture of the situation that I would submit as a very grim one in Venezuela for journalism?
Thank you very much. I'm not familiar with the specific case, but I can tell you, I mean, the contours of this case is sort of a model that we're seeing in Venezuela and elsewhere again and again. You know, I mentioned the authorities seizing the headquarters of El Nacional, and it was basically after the Supreme Court of Venezuela ordered it to pay more than US $13 million in damages for alleged defamation. And so you see the kind of the control of the courts, the use of sort of defamation charges, the use of fraud, and the heavy fines that come with it as a sort of larger element of a problem where governments are trying to close any dissenting media outlets and carry out a kind of campaign of stigmatization and repression against the media. And so very few newspapers or websites or radio stations in Venezuela can criticize authorities anymore. They fear reprisals. They're really made to self-censor. And so we've seen this sort of again and again, and certainly Venezuela is sort of a model for this. We also saw that in Venezuela in 2017, the Constituent Assembly passed a very vague law, which they call the kind of law against hatred, which, forbids political parties from promoting, fascism, hatred, and intolerance, and establishes sort of prison sentences of up to 20 years for publishing anything that they call messages of intolerance and hatred. But it's kind of being misused in a lot of ways where during the COVID-19 state of emergency that was imposed, many people sharing or publishing information on social media, questioning officials or their policies around the pandemic, have been charged with incitement to hatred and other crimes.
And that actually leads to where I was going to go next, which was for you to elaborate a little bit on how the Maduro regime has exploited COVID in terms of cracking down, including what we have seen in terms of a significant number of arbitrary detention of journalists.
Yeah. So you really, I mean, in Venezuela, you really see in a lot of ways in terms of the effect of the pandemic, you see a collapsed healthcare system that's led to kind of the resurgence of, vaccine preventable and infectious diseases. And hundreds of people are allegedly dying due to barriers to access to healthcare. And so you have a very serious, collapse of the healthcare system even prior to the COVID pandemic that's only been kind of made worse. And then certainly you see a very similar, playbook where vaccination has been marred by corruption allegations and a lack of transparency in terms of who gets the vaccines, what the distribution is like. You see government, the government of Venezuela using the COVID-19 pandemic in order to further restrict space for civil society. And so you see in the Maduro government so much of the same playbook that you see again and again in repressive states around the pandemic and the kind of the use of the opportunities that the pandemic creates in order to further restrict people's individual rights and freedoms.
Would you consider the situation in Venezuela to be deteriorating?
Yeah, I mean, we certainly see that. We see that the government, the Maduro government, and the security forces over certainly these past few years, we've seen an increasing worsening of the situation. We've seen extrajudicial executions, forced disappearances of jailed opponents, the prosecution of civilians in military courts, torture of detainees, crackdowns on protests, the use of the state of emergency in response to COVID as a pretext to intensify the government's control over the population, no judicial independence, certainly, contributing to kind of impunity for the Maduro government's crimes. And so certainly we see a real worsening of the situation.
Thank you for that. Now I want to turn my attention to Nicaragua. That's a country that you did not mention, but do you have concerns about the situation there, including the special cybercrime law?
Yeah, I mean, I can't really speak to that in detail, I'm afraid.
But are you able to speak at all about the situation in Nicaragua under the Ortega regime?
Yes, sure. In Nicaragua, I think what we're seeing in a lot of ways is an enormous concentration of power by President Ortega. So very similar to the playbook that I described kind of earlier in my statement. You see the government committing really widespread and egregious abuses against critics with complete impunity. We're seeing, armed pro-government groups brutally repressing anti-government protesters, killing hundreds. You're seeing arbitrary detentions. The Nicaraguan government really intensifying its crackdown on civil society and the free press. And so a lot of, very worrying signs. And we've been, calling for within Human Rights Watch, and at the Human Rights Council to really ensure that there's increasing scrutiny of the human rights situation in Nicaragua and the renewal of several sort of mandates for monitoring the human rights situation in the country.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank
you, Ms. Steve.
Thank you, Mr. Cooper. We now turn to Monsieur Trudel. You have 7 minutes, sir.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you to our witnesses for being with us here this evening. I have a question for Mr. Diamond about the situation in Algeria. I have a citizen in my riding, Mr. Lazare Zouimia, who works with Amnesty International in Quebec, and who supports human rights over there, has been doing so for about 15 years, but based from Quebec. His situation is quite dramatic. He has 2 children here and his wife. He lost his 21-year-old son in a car accident about a year ago. He went to Algeria to carry out some prayers and a funeral rite and go back to his hometown village, and he was stopped at the airport. He was imprisoned on trumped-up charges of terrorism. So it's been brought to the attention of Amnesty International, and it's about a month ago that this happened. Now, there is a complex issue, given that he is both a Canadian citizen and an Algerian citizen. The Algerian state, the state of Algeria, denies his Canadian citizenship, so will not give him any access to consular services. The situation, of course, is very difficult. So, Mr. Diamond, is this the sort of thing that you have seen before? Do you know of his case, by the way? Mr. Zoenia, that's my first question.
Adele, I have not heard of this case, and thank you for bringing the disturbing details of this case to our attention. It's not a country that we have focused on yet, but as a dual Canadian national, it is something that we are certainly engaged with in terms of other cases like Hussein Jalil, Dr. Reza Eslami, and other Canadians detained abroad. So I'd like you to see us as partners, and if you'd like to set up a meeting or join our all-parliamentarian party caucus on human rights, where we help design advocacy plans for specific political or arbitrarily detained Canadian citizens abroad, and we can discuss the full range of methods available.
Dites-moi, est-ce que vous pouvez me parler de la situation en Algérie?
Could you tell me more about the situation in Algeria? I understand you're not aware of this specific case, but have you heard of similar cases, citizens being imprisoned, people with dual citizenship, dual nationality with Canada, and from other countries as well? Is Algeria at present cracking down more than it did in the past? What's the situation? What's their human rights situation there?
Yeah, so I can't speak to the specifics of Algeria, but it's part of a global trend of seeing hostage taking as a legitimate foreign policy tool. And that's why, Canada's leadership on this, on the state-to-state declaration needs to be implemented through an action plan more vigorously, and consular assistance needs to be vigorously pursued as well in this case.
Bon, on va passer sur l'Algérie.
Very well. Thank you for that on Algeria. Do you think, Mr. Diamond, that overall the human rights abuses globally now are on the rise? And if so, in what areas of the world?
Yeah, that's a great question. We certainly see basically every metric globally resurging with authoritarianism and backsliding of democracies, with severe implications for human rights, especially over the course of the pandemic. It's only exacerbated poverty inequalities, but also repression. And in Russia, for example, I know there's a lot of interest lately. Before the military buildup, there was already a backsliding through repressive policies. Most disturbingly, perhaps recently, in the shutdown of the leading human rights organization in Russia, Memorial, under the Foreign Agents Law. But these sort of things have been happening around the world, and that's why it's so important to have studies like this and re-engaging after the pandemic, because we've certainly slid back. In the Philippines too, as I mentioned, there's an election in May, where there's been an escalation in internal domestic crackdowns in the past few years during Duterte's time in office, including a crackdown on journalists and lawyers killed, political opponents, what the Nobel laureate Maria Reza has called death by 1,000 cuts to democracy and media freedom, including over 200 attacks and threats, including 22 murders of journalists in the Philippines. And like I said, there's an increase in murders of human rights defenders worldwide. And of course, I briefly mentioned this, but in China, there's been increasing repressive measures and more restrictive measures to accessing the Xinjiang region, where a genocide is underway against the Uyghurs. Those are just a couple of examples of these trends worldwide.
Merci, Monsieur Diamond. Il me reste un petit peu de temps.
Thank you, Mr. Diamond. I have a few moments left, correct, Chair? So, Ms. Deef, I have a question for you. I would like to hear something about democratic countries that are also carrying out human rights abuses on human rights defenders around the globe. You mentioned India. Are there any other supposedly democratic countries who are also carrying out these sorts of abuses on human rights defenders?
Thank you. I mean, yes, we're certainly seeing the same trend. I mean, I mentioned India, Israel as well, in terms of allies of Canada and the kind of concerns that we have around those countries. I'm trying to think, there certainly the backsliding in human rights is something that we're seeing across the board. I mean, we're seeing some positive elements in terms of an increase in mobilization of human rights defenders, in the use of social media, to promote human rights, in the use of, technology, investigative technology to document those abuses. But as we're seeing at the same time, we're seeing, different elements of problems where even though there's an increase in mobilization on human rights, there's, new tools that governments, including democracies, can be using to suppress dissent. And so I spoke earlier around, one particular software surveillance technology called Pegasus that's being misused to really gain access to, the private communication of journalists, activists, and world leaders. And this is a space where we don't see really kind of regulation in any way. And it's a really worrying trend because it's a new tool that can be used by both democracies and non-democracies and misused in very
Deef,
harmful
if I could
ways.
ask you to wrap it up, please.
No, I'm fine. That's all I have to say on that.
Thank you very much, Ms. Deef. We now turn to Ms. McPherson. You have 7 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I want to thank both our witnesses today. This has been, extremely enlightening and very interesting, very worrying, of course, as well. As we're hearing about the backsliding in protections for human rights around the world, it is deeply disturbing to hear this. One of the things that I picked up on a number of times, Ms. Deef, when you spoke about, turning a blind eye and the need for Canada as a country that we all want Canada to be, to continuously call out these abuses when they happen. What happens when we don't do that? What happens when Canada does turn a blind eye, like they have done in Israel and in Palestine, like they have done in other countries? We had a witness come to this committee and testify from the Philippines on the impacts that Canadian companies have had working in her country. Her life was in danger. And what obligations do we have as Canadians to call this out, and what happens when we don't meet that obligation?
Thank you for your question. I mean, we're seeing this again and again, in terms of, I think what we've seen in the case of Ukraine, for example, right now, is how the Canadian government can use very effectively every tool in its toolkit, whether it's sort of sanctions, asset freezes, accountability at the International Criminal Court, to really push forward and condemn, human rights abuses that are occurring. But we also see, unfortunately, that that's really rare, that this government has been using every tool in its toolkit to call out these abuses. And so what happens, I think, to answer your question, what happens when this government doesn't condemn the actions of allies like Israel, when it commits serious human rights abuses? What happens when the government obstructs international criminal court proceedings, trying to investigate, for example, the Israeli government's actions in the Palestinian territories. What happens is it gives the green light for governments to commit these abuses. We've seen the misuse of counterterrorism legislation, and it's really important for this government to have a very principled approach to the misuse of counterterrorism legislation to muzzle peaceful human rights dissent. That should be a kind of a red line. And so whether it's an ally or a country where, this government has very poor relations, whichever country is committing those types of abuses, is misusing counterterrorism legislation as a way to muzzle peaceful dissent, there should be a statement of condemnation. And when you don't see a statement of condemnation, it really gives a green light for other governments to do the same, but it also sends the message to civil society organizations that the Canadian government doesn't really care about their plight. And so we've seen this in a number of countries. I mean, we've seen this in Egypt, we've seen this in Israel, we've seen this elsewhere, where when the government is close to a particular, when this government is close to a particular government, we don't see the same robust action, the same robust condemnation. We often see radio silence, and that really sends a very worrying message and signal to civil society organizations and partner groups who are really looking to Canada to have a principled and pragmatic approach to these abuses.
Certainly, if Canada does not have that principled stance, it's very difficult to expect other countries to do so. One of the other things that I'm seized with, of course, right now is what's happening in Ukraine. And you're right that the government has done an awful lot for the people of Ukraine, and as they should. This is a very desperate situation, but it has not been the same across the board for other countries. And I do wonder, the misinformation that we've seen come out of Russia, the lies that we've seen come out of Belarus, the human rights issues that started in there and have been going on there for a very long time that were not called out or were not acted upon. Could Canada have done more in that situation? And also, how does Canada work multilaterally? How do we work with our allies? How do we work with our international multilateral institutions to better protect human rights defenders around the world, to better protect journalists? And I'd like you to sort of answer that both in terms of actions we can take, but also legislation that we could be bringing forward, ways that we could be using our International Criminal Court and International Court of Justice. Like, what are some of those tangible things that Canada could do right now? That's a very meaty question. Sorry about that.
No, it's fine. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, so I guess there's a number of things. I mean, we often struggle as, international human rights activists to convince the government of Canada and to convince global affairs to be outspoken at the United Nations Human Rights Council on country-specific situations. There's only really a subset of countries that the Canadian government engages on at the Human Rights Council. It's, they're often much more comfortable with thematic issues that are a bit sort of softer, like, violence against women, LGBT issues. Those are sort of easier issues. And so what we hear again and again is, we engage with this government bilaterally. We engage with, this government privately, but they don't do so in a really public way. And I don't think the government does enough at the Human Rights Council to really address country-specific situations. We've seen certainly a change in that approach with respect to Ukraine, but it really is in a lot of ways anomalous. So we would love to see more of that type of kind of robust action by this government at the United Nations, at the General Assembly, the Human Rights Council in Geneva, and then also within the International Criminal Court. Canada is a founding member of the International Criminal Court, and so should really be at the forefront of accountability efforts. But what we've seen in the cases in which, when you have an ally, I mentioned Israel earlier, is the government is not keen to move forward on even, accountability and justice for really serious international crimes. And so when you ask global affairs, well, where then do the Palestinians go to remedy the serious international crimes that they've experienced, under the Israeli occupation? They have no answer. There's really nowhere for them to go. And so so, we really need to take a principled stance for every country situation, whether it's an ally or not, around these issues. We've seen this similarly around LGBTQ issues where, in some cases, the government is very vocal. In other cases, we see that the approach is much more one of private diplomacy. But unfortunately, private diplomacy, results in very little, because the offending government can very easily kind of drag on the situation for years. It's really not, forced to take any action. And so I think it's really important for the government to take a principled stance on these issues at the world stage, at the International Criminal Court, and not kind of promote a sort of double standard. And, we see this as well with the...
Wrap up your comments.
Sorry, Ms. Deef.
Sorry, just to say that we see this as well with the Global Declaration on Arbitrary Detention, which was done very specifically.
Ms. Deef, you're way over time. If I could ask you to just conclude. Thank you very much. Now we're going to move to the second round, but given that we are way over time and we are expecting to hear from a second panel as well, if I could ask each of the members to restrict themselves and their questions to 2 minutes. Now we start off with Ms. Vandenbelt.
I'll share my time with Mr. Oliphant.
You have 2 minutes, Mr. Oliphant.
Thank you. I'm just responding. I held my tongue when I was listening to the answer on Algeria, and I tend to think that that is such a complex case that it does a disservice to this committee if people who don't know the topic talk about it. So I would hope that we can speak about Algeria later at an appropriate time with witnesses who actually know something about both the consular nature of the case and the extremely difficult situation that is ongoing. However, I also want to ask Ms. Deef if she can list the number of times that Canada has led the way in the last year, either writing with pen or co-sponsoring resolutions at the UN Human Rights Council, what their role was, what our role as a Canadian government was with respect to Ethiopia and the Tigray situation, what our role is at the International Criminal Court with vis-a-vis Ukraine, and the many ways in which we have engaged in the Human Rights Council as well as the UN on these important issues. If she could provide a list of those, I think that might be helpful for the committee. And I also think it's equally important to talk about the difference between shaming and engaging, and how diplomats do take it very seriously when we do public discourse about human rights situations and when we do quiet discourse. And one is not 0 and the other 100, but they actually are thought about as important different methods of engagement on important human rights issues. If she has any comments on that.
Thank you for your question. I mean, I'm not going to go over a list of the actions that the government has taken at the Human Rights Council. There are a number of actions, but it is still a struggle for us to take, for the government to take on country situations. That is kind of just a fact. There's been a number of country situations, but there's certainly not enough. Let me just give you an example in case it's helpful. Egypt, for example, I happen to be a dual national of that country. So even me speaking at this committee on the human rights abuses in Egypt actually, can put me in jeopardy and my family in Egypt in jeopardy. But let me tell you what we tried to do with Global Affairs Canada around Egypt and how difficult it was to convince Global Affairs to sign on to a joint statement, the first one calling out the CC government for its repressive human rights practices at the Human Rights Council. This was done, Canadian officials were part of a diplomatic group that met with Egyptian civil society organizations, and then were, the civil society organizations were then arrested for having a meeting with diplomats.
Ms. Deef, if I could ask you to wrap it up in 10 seconds, please.
Yeah. just to say, even in those cases, it was a tremendous effort and struggle to encourage global affairs. That they finally eventually did join a joint statement at the HRC on Egypt, but it was extremely difficult to get them there because the
Thank you, Ms.
reflex,
Deef.
especially with allies.
Ms. Deef, I'm afraid we're going to have to move to the next member. Now we turn to Mr. Viersen. You have 2 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank the witnesses for being here as well. Mr. Diamond, you talked a little bit about specifically Canadian citizen human rights defenders who are either in prison or under sanction in other countries. What's the scope of that situation? Are we talking hundreds of people? Are we talking tens of people? And do you have any specific recommendations for the Canadian government to undertake to help some of these, particularly folks that are involved in, say, like the media journalism space? Mr. Diamond?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think these cases also deserve a delicate balance, and they're case specific between, private diplomacy and public shaming or accountability tools to use. But we certainly need to legalize, put into law, consular assistance and protection as a requirement in line with international legal obligations. And I can't speak to the exact numbers, but of course, it's most imprisoned Canadians abroad are actually in the States. But in terms of imprisoned rights defenders, I can't speak to the exact number, but it's a growing concern.
Mr. Diamond, would it be what would a solution look like? Pick a particular case. I think you mentioned Mr. Hassan. Particular case. Are we looking to try to get them out of the country? Are we looking for us to just speak to the situation? What's a specific thing that Canada can do to try to either? Are we trying to get him out of the country, or are we trying to just get them out of jail? What's our goal on that?
Yeah, the ultimate goal should be seeking the release of the prisoner, but it's obviously a long process, and the prisoners need to remain a key priority, in the foreign minister's mandate, and certainly has to remain a priority, It really depends on each situation and the family members' preferences, but there should be really robust engagement with both civil society or activists close to the case, but also the family, to ensure that their interests and needs are on a constant basis being reinforced and supported, because that's what's most important in these cases, and we need more transparency and engagement in that regard.
Thank you, Mr. Viersen. We now turn to Mr. Trudel. You have 2 minutes, sir.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Madame Deef.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Deef. Of course, these are horrific cases, but is there any country in the world, we have been saying that as of a number of years, there are a number of countries where human rights abuses on human rights defenders are getting worse. Are there any countries then where things are getting any better? Do we have any such examples of such countries? And are we aware of what these countries have done to improve the situation? What are the factors that feed into improving the situation? To Ms. Deef and, of course, to Mr. Diamond as well. Ms. Deef first.
Yeah, that's a very difficult question. No country kind of comes to mind right now in terms of a real improvement in the human rights situation in that country. So I think I'll have to get back to you with information on that and what the factors were that perhaps led to it. You often see elections potentially resulting in new governments that are possibly less repressive, but none come to mind at the moment, I'm afraid.
Mr. Diamond,
Mr. Diamond, do you have anything to add to that?
As the focus is repressive states and considering the downward trends, I too would likewise pass on this.
Okay, bon, j'ai vraiment pas beaucoup de temps.
I'm sorry, I haven't much time left. Ms. Deef, we've seen that before the war in Ukraine, in Russia, human rights were already a big issue, a big problem. Do you think that the international community, and more specifically Canada, have reacted strongly enough to counter these sorts of flagrant human rights abuses, journalists assassinated, put into prison? Do you think we're strong enough, vocal enough?
I mean, I think with respect to Russia, even prior to the conflict, you did see kind of wide-reaching sanctions that were imposed by the Canadian government on Russian officials who have committed, widespread human rights abuses, on officials who, are corrupt. So there is, and officials that are kind of linked to Crimea and the conflict. And so, with respect to Russia, I've seen, I think even prior to this conflict, there's been a number of positive actions that have been taken, kind of robust use of the Justice for Corrupt Foreign Officials Act, the Magnitsky legislation. And so with respect to Russia, with respect to Venezuela, countries that are, where Canada has very sort of poor relations, you do see quite a robust response even prior to the conflict. The challenge that we have is having the government speak out when there are strong bilateral trade, diplomatic, and other relationships, and speak out even when there's small steps and deteriorations that might lead to bigger issues.
Thank you, Ms. Deef. If we can now turn to Ms. McPherson for 2 minutes, please.
I'll be very, very quick on my 2 minutes. Mr. Diamond, I just had some questions for you, if I could. You spoke a little bit about how these situations are case-specific, and I was happy to meet with Mr. Coulter in December, and we talked about journalists, and we talked about the impact of detained journalists. And so while I recognize that there is this individuality and this case specificness of it, as a parliamentarian, of course, I'm looking for solutions that are bigger, that we can use in terms of legislation, in terms of applying sanctions, whatnot. If you could give us just a bit of a sense of the best way as parliamentarians, as lawmakers in Canada, we can work both within our own parliament and with our own government, but also with other governments and also with other multilateral groups. What is the best way for us to be protecting journalists right now, writ large, not case specific?
So not just Canadian journalists?
Both Canadian and non. 2 minutes, and you've got to answer all that. Sorry.
Yeah. For Canadians, I do think it's a bit of a different analysis and needs to be taken in concert with other actors involved and the families. But in terms of journalists writ large abroad, Canada's taken a leadership position on this, establishing media freedom panels and conferences. But we need to, as you mentioned, implement stronger action on this in terms of standing up for journalists abroad. And when they're locked up abroad, it turns out in the vast majority of cases, public statements and attention from government officials and the UN, where those statements carry more weight and legitimacy, those are critical for long-term advocacy, because these are often long processes. For journalists around the world, it's a broader problem of the threats against the media, which is why the Nobel Oslo Committee awarded the Nobel Peace Prize to 2 journalists this year. But that's what I'll say briefly.
Thank you very much. Allow me, on behalf of this committee, to thank both of our witnesses for having provided us very informative information. We're very, very grateful and certainly look forward to having you appear before us very soon, I hope. Now, we have a few minutes before we go to the second panel for sound check. So we will now suspend for a few minutes. Thank you, members. It's me great pleasure to now welcome our second set of panelists. As a reminder, I should say, translation is also available through the globe icon on the bottom of the screens of people who are following us virtually. Now, our two witnesses for this second panel will consist of, from UNESCO, we are pleased to have Mr. Guilherme Canela de Souza Godoy, who is the Chief of the Freedom of Expression and Safety of Journalists Division at UNESCO. And we also have, from Reporters Without Borders, Mr. Clayton Weimers, Deputy Director of the Washington, D.C. Bureau. Thank you for being with us this evening. Now, if we could start off with Mr. de Souza Godoy, you have 5 minutes for your opening remarks.
Good evening, Mr. Chair. It's a pleasure to be here with you. I thank you and the members of the committee for inviting UNESCO to contribute to this very timely study on the situation of human rights defenders, journalists, and media organizations. I would also like to acknowledge Canada's important role in these global coalitions related to these issues, the Media Freedom Coalition, the Freedom Online Coalition. I hope I will be as coherent and as comprehensive as possible, considering that it is 37 minutes past midnight for me here in Paris. So I apologize in advance if this is not the case. As you know, UNESCO is the leading UN specialized agency for promoting freedom of expression and particularly coordinating the United Nations plan on the safety of journalists and the issue of impunity. So I hope I can present to you some global trends in this area, although I won't be able to comment on the specific country situations. But as I said, your study is very timely and for different reasons. We just published a global study, a global report on trends on freedom of expression and media development. And unfortunately, we have underlined that in the last 4 years, 85% of the global population have witnessed a downside in their own press freedom. And this has really been exacerbated during the 2 years of the pandemic, when we found a perfect storm towards reducing freedom of expression and press freedom. And why we are calling this perfect storm? Because different things that were prior to the pandemic separate situations undermining press freedom, for instance, regulatory challenges or safety of journalists challenges or media viability challenges or disinformation, misinformation challenges, they unfortunately came together to undermine press freedom. But there are also some windows of opportunity. This year, we are celebrating the 10th anniversary of the United Nations Plan of Action on Safety of Journalists and the issue of impunity. So a huge opportunity for a study like that to contribute on what can be improved in the overall scenario of protecting journalists worldwide. We are also in the middle of the way towards 2030. As you know, we have a specific goal under the 2030 agenda, the Sustainable Development Goal number 1610, where there is a special target in protecting human rights defenders, journalists, and trade unionists. So this study can be also very helpful in that regard. So just the key elements of these global studies of UNESCO, and I gladly can send these detailed elements to the committee afterwards. On the last 4 years, we have monitored 400 killings of journalists, which is obviously an absurd number. These killings are connected with another very complex statistics, that is 9 out of 10 of those killings remain with no solution in the judicial system. So the impunity rates are very high in terms of safety of journalists. And together with that, we have very specific situations that were also underlined in the previous panel. UNESCO has published a particular issue brief on the safety of foreign correspondents with very new challenges in this area aside of the usual challenges on their safety, on their physical safety. We have published a very long study about the safety of journalists reporting on protests and riots, underlying violations in more than 65 countries. We have published specific information about reducing press freedom under the context of COVID-19 that I can, if necessary, go further later on. We have published specific discussions about the digital challenges and digital safety for journalists, particularly for women journalists. We did a global survey with women journalists. 7 and 10 of the women journalists who responded to this survey reported online attacks against them. And we have a specific situation of using courts trying to censor the media. It's what's called SLAPS, this strategic litigation against public speech. So as you can see, there is an overall set of elements that are contributing to undermine press freedom and freedom of expression, globally speaking. To end with some suggestions in terms of recommendations we are making to our member states that could be useful for your discussions. The UN Plan of Action on Safety of Journalism, Innovation, and Impunity speaks about these 3 Ps: prevention, protection, and prosecution of the crimes. We do think those 3 elements are particularly relevant to address any issues. And there is now an overall opportunity for Canada to contribute to this discussion. Either it is, as was mentioned before, in the Human Rights Committee through the Universal Periodical Review, or in New York through the Voluntary National Reviews to the 2030 Agenda, or in UNESCO through the Director General's report on the safety of journalists and the issue of impunity. And through the leadership of Canada and the Global Media Freedom Coalition, already contributing, for instance, with the UNESCO Global Media Defense Fund, are always very concrete ways of addressing this issue. I thank you very much, and obviously at your disposition for the questions. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. D'Souza Godoy. Now, if we could turn to Mr. Weimers, you have 5 minutes for your opening statement, Mr. Weimers.
Thank you very much, and thank you for holding this session and inviting Reporters Without Borders to participate. I'm very glad that my fellow witness before me mentioned impunity so often. We are going to have a similar theme that we're both going to be touching on here. Over 1,000 journalists and media personnel have been killed while exercising their profession over the last 15 years. We at RSF are committed not just to documenting and highlighting these negative conditions facing journalists, but actively improving the situation. In conflict zones such as Syria and Ukraine, journalists are being deliberately targeted. 4 journalists have been killed in Ukraine since the war began. 2 have disappeared. Many more have been shot at, harassed, detained. RSF is documenting each and every case, and it's essential that we hold responsible parties accountable. We cannot allow journalists to be targeted with impunity. Now, from the outset of Russia's invasion, we knew we also needed to be involved on the ground. That's why we rushed to set up the Lviv Press Freedom Center, which is a hub for all journalists who are covering the conflict. It's located in the western Ukrainian city of Lviv. It's a place any reporter can go to collect protective gear like helmets and bulletproof vests, get financial or digital security support, or even just find a quiet place to charge their phone and file their story. But the dangers facing journalists are not limited to war zones. Right here in our North American backyard, 7 journalists have been killed in Mexico in 2022 alone, and it's only March. And again, these murders against reporters are carried out with apparent impunity. The problem is indeed global, and all democratic governments have a responsibility to help protect journalists around the world. To that end, I'd like to highlight one emblematic case with a uniquely Canadian angle. Saudi blogger Raif Badawi has been released from prison after serving a 10-year sentence for insulting Islam online. He was released last week, but now he's facing a 10-year travel ban. And why is that significant? Well, his wife and 3 children have resettled in Quebec. It's long past time for Raif to be reunited with his family, and RSF strongly urges the Canadian government and the Saudi government to work together and do whatever it takes to bring the family back together. Raif's case is just one that is deeply illustrative of the dangers facing journalists in repressive regimes, not just in Saudi Arabia, but around the world. Despite widely agreed upon norms and recent gains in an international legal framework, repressive regimes act against the free press with impunity. As I said, this is a global problem, and so it's going to require a global solution. That's why RSF is also urging Canada to support a United Nations resolution calling for the creation of a special envoy for the protection of journalists. This will give the international community a concrete mechanism to support international law and protect journalists worldwide. It's a vital step towards ending the impunity. Thank you again for holding this session and inviting me to speak. I look forward to taking your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Weimers. Thank you, Mr. De Souza Godoy. Now, if we could turn to questions from the members, I would ask, we're going to have 2 rounds. For the first round, if we could keep questions restricted to 5 minutes, please. And for the second round, it will be 4 minutes each. So we start off with Mr. Zuberi.
Thanks to both the witnesses for being here and really focusing in on the importance of protecting journalists in the human rights context. I'd like to start off with Reporters Without Borders, Mr. Weimers. I've perused your site and saw the map that you have of the world, and of certain countries that are indicated in black, which are having very bad records when it comes to press freedom, and others in red, which also don't have stellar records. Do you want to tell us a bit about how you make that schema, how you determine which countries fall into the black zone, into the red zone, etc.? And please, go ahead.
Sure. So there's a scoring system that takes into account a huge amount of data, and it starts with obvious things like the arbitrary arrest or the murder of a journalist, and the level of impunity that perpetrators of attacks against journalists enjoy in that country, and it goes down to more qualitative data as well. We have correspondents in the ground in most countries, and if they can't be in a particular country, they're monitoring the country from abroad, who are really keyed in on the situation that reporters on the ground face day in, day out, and are registering what the culture of free press is in those particular countries. So if you look at any particular country's page on our website as well, there should be a score accompanying their ranking. That is, at the end of the day, what's going to determine whether they fall into the black or the dark red zone. And I'm glad you asked, because we're actually in the process of analyzing the data for next year's index, which will be coming out on International World Press Freedom Day this May. We have actually revamped the system a little bit. We're going to be taking in even more data than we ever have before. So we are hoping that this is going to be the most accurate representation of the situation of press freedom in various countries.
Interestingly, I perused through your site and saw tried to look for a difference between 2019 and 2021, and I noticed that America actually improved on your record, so that was really interesting to observe. I didn't notice any other countries that had a marked improvement, although I do hope that there's a positive trend to the future. I'd like to go ahead, please, if you have a particular.
Well, I was going to say, from one year to the next, it would be rare to see a significant change unless there is some sort of large-scale political change. But if you look for over a longer period, maybe 3, 4, 5 years, you're more likely to see shifts up and down the list.
That's really, I'll look out for that personally. I'd like to now go to our other witness and ask, in your opinion, how can Canada leverage our capacities on the international stage at the bilateral, multilateral meetings? How can we leverage what we have to really shore up press freedoms around the world? If I could just turn to the other witness, please.
Yeah, sure. So first, as you know, Canada is a co-chair of the Media Freedom Coalition, currently co-chairing this caucus with the Netherlands. So in that space, obviously, there is a lot to be done in raising awareness and underlining violations of press freedom, media freedom, and freedom of expression, globally speaking. But on a more specific set of suggestions, I may, if with your permission, underline three that is very concrete. As Clayton just mentioned, in next May, we will have the World Press Freedom Day, which this year will be celebrated under the topic Journalism Under Digital Siege. So I think this is a very important opportunity for Canada and your missions abroad to really underline the issues, the different elements of attacking journalism and press freedom worldwide, in supporting those players, civil society organizations and others that are actually in this huge fight to protect press freedom global-wide. This is number one. Number two, as I also mentioned, this year is that we are commemorating the 10th anniversary of the United Nations Plan of Action on Safety of Journalists and the issue of impunity. Canada is a member of different caucus in different UN headquarters, is what we call the Group of Friends of Safety of Journalists. So Canada can really be a very strategic player, which is already being in supporting and further enhancing the importance of this global United Nations plan to the safety of journalists and the issue of impunity. And finally, the different processes for specific countries that under the Human Rights Committee that we call the Universal Periodical Review, it would be very, very important if Canada can really keep a very good eye on the specific issues of freedom of expression and press freedom when a particular country is being examined under the Universal Periodical Review. As you know, it's a global human rights review process, and we do need to have a more specific and intensive discussion of press freedom and freedom of expression issues during the Universal Periodical Review process for the different countries. Thank you.
Mr. D'Souza Godi for those specific examples.
Thank you. We now turn to Mr. Viersen. Mr. Viersen, you have 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to return to Mr. Weimer's. Just talking about this, I'm intrigued by these press freedom centers. Could you explain that a little bit more, how that works? And is there any country that participates in that and maybe like provides their consular services to be a place where one of these places could be set up? I'm thinking Canada could perhaps participate in allowing our consular services to have one of these press freedom centers kind of adjacent to it or tied on to the side of it or something like that. Mr. Weimers?
I think that is a really interesting suggestion, one that we're not currently engaged in, but that is definitely something that I think would be interesting. The way our Press Freedom Center works in Lviv is it is a fully donor-funded project which is there to be a resource for any journalist, whether they're a freelancer or they have the backing of a media organization, or even if they're a citizen journalist. You know, citizen journalists are often forgotten when we're talking about protections for journalists, and they lack many of the resources that their colleagues at large media organizations might enjoy. But you know, it was clear from the outset of this war that too many reporters were ill-equipped going to cover a war zone, down to the very basics of having press accreditation and a helmet and a bulletproof vest and a first aid kit with their party. So, you know, the primary focus that we have undertaken here is to make sure that we can be of material support to reporters and provide this resource. And one of the big challenges has been getting these kinds of materials sourced in Europe. Many suppliers are out, and many governments have pretty severe restrictions on anything that they would consider to be military grade, which obviously comes into play when you're talking about bulletproof vests. And, you know, so we've had, if I'm imagining any way that a Canadian consulate, for example, could be of assistance, one of those ways would be to facilitate the resupply of that protective gear for journalists.
Recommendation, kind of exactly what we're kind of looking for. Just you touched just upon it briefly around credentialing. What's the process for your organization to credential, and how do you make that assertion?
Well, I should be clear, Reporters Without Borders does not credential journalists because we are not a media organization. We're just an NGO, but we do work a lot with freelance reporters who don't have official accreditation necessarily from a media organization, and we can connect them. But oftentimes, if you are going in as a freelance journalist, you might not have that helmet that says press on it. You might not have that vest that says press on it, and that can often be, the difference between, say, a soldier on the ground stopping you or not stopping you, shooting at you or not shooting at you. So these things make big differences.
Is there some need for assistance in your estimation around credentialing, and is there opportunity for us to help with that?
I think credentialing, it's mostly up to the organizations themselves. The Ukrainian government also, has to respect press credentials. We have seen some issues where curfews have been imposed, or where credentials have been revoked in certain cities or under certain situations. It's a very fluid situation in Ukraine, and we have to accept that there's always going to be some risks when it comes to covering a war zone. I think the most important thing to keep in mind, if we're talking about what governments like Canada's could do to help, is make sure that in your dialogues with your Ukrainian counterparts that you're emphasizing the importance of respecting the free access of information, allowing reporters to do their jobs, not stopping them from documenting what's going on.
Just quickly to reinforce that recommendation you made a minute ago, just around the equipment. What kind of equipment are we talking about?
We're talking about bulletproof vests, flak jackets, helmets, tourniquets, first aid kits.
You're looking for Canada help with that. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Peterson. We now turn to Monsieur Trudel. You have 5 minutes, sir.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. My question is for Mr. Weimer. Earlier, you spoke of the case of Rodolphe Badawi. I would like to go back to that. It's a very well-covered case. We hear a good deal about this case in the media, certainly in Quebec here and in Canada. His wife, his spouse, being a Quebecoise who lives in Sherbrooke. There has been mention of this in the House of Commons. We know that in Quebec, people get together to protest about this. Journalists out there talk about it. There's been a meeting with the spouse of Raoul Badawi, who has met Prime Minister Trudeau. Nevertheless, and despite the fact that Canada has argued for better treatment of this person and that a motion has been adopted in the House, what else should we do? What should we have done? What can we do to ensure that Mr. Badawi doesn't spend another long time in Saudi Arabia, even though he's out of prison after a 10-year prison term? We're wondering whether he'll be able to join his spouse here. So what has Canada not done that it could have done that would have helped, and that could help now? What do we do now that Mr. Badawi is over there with his children here, his family here? What could we say? What could Canada put forward? What means could we use now and leverage now to ensure that Mr. Badawi is able to return to Quebec?
I think it's a great question. It's a very complicated situation, obviously. I think one thing that has been discussed is granting Mr. Badawi Canadian citizenship. I think that can potentially change the conversation with the Saudi government. I think it becomes much less tenable to have a travel restriction on a Canadian citizen. And I think it's also just important to keep this story alive, to keep talking about it, to not let it get brushed under the rug. Too often, cases like Raif Badawi's, they happen, they garner a lot of media attention, and then, the repressive regime simply waits it out and waits for the general public to move on to the next story. We can't let that happen. We have to keep the pressure on. We have to let the Saudi government know that we're paying attention and that we're engaged, and that we're not going to stop until they do the right thing here and allow the Badawi family to reunite.
Merci, Monsieur Weimers.
Thank you, Mr. Weimer. And picking up on that, Mr. Sousa Goudai, still about Mr. Badawi. This is a case that has been much covered by the media. In your opinion, generally speaking, often negotiations can take place to ensure that people, human rights defenders, are freed here, there, and everywhere around the world. Things that, go on state to state. There are also cases that are in the media, in the headlines that everyone's talking about. And sometimes it's said that in such cases, governments, especially repressive governments, don't want to lose face. So more journalists talk about the case, less likely it is that we'll be able to get them out in some sort of quieter negotiation. What do you think? Is it better, generally speaking, when you're dealing with a highly repressive state to leave things to diplomacy? Or can going to the media be a useful tool?
And it's a very difficult one. In my 20 years experience as an international civil servant dealing with freedom of expression, I have witnessed all the different elements to reply to your question, and they are not all the same. So in many situations, quiet diplomacy is very effective in dealing with those cases. In many other situations, being outspoken is the more efficient course of action. And it's very difficult to know where precisely this would be the case because there isn't a particular criteria to be applied. That's why it's so important to have a very conscious and permanent monitoring of freedom of expression and press freedom situation, because this allows us, the multilateral environment, but also the bilateral diplomacy, to be aware what is the best situation to be applied considering each case. But if you allow me, I think in terms of the medium term and long term actions, we see in this report UNESCO have just launched that we still have 160 countries with defamation laws all over the world. And obviously this kind of situation of arresting journalists and using criminal law to attack freedom of expression is only possible because we still have these kind of legislations that are completely against the international standards, the recommendation of the Human Rights Committee and the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights. So I think countries like Canada can advocate even more for countries to really decriminalize freedom of expression and treat eventual problems of freedom of expression under civil law and not under criminal law.
Mr. Godoy.
Mr. Godoy.
And turn to Ms. McPherson. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to both the witnesses for joining us today, particularly those of you who are joining in the middle of the night. I apologize for keeping you up.
two witnesses for the inexplicable technical challenges we had there. We will now resume. Ms. McPherson, you have 5 minutes for your questions.
Thank you. And again, thank you for everyone for being here. I was going to follow up on some of my colleague from the Block's questions and ask a few questions of our witness from UNESCO. He spoke about the need for prevention, protection, and prosecution. And you spoke a little bit about how that prosecution can happen. In the international fora, what is the best solution, or how can countries be held accountable to these human rights abuses against journalists? What's the best strategy for that? Or what's a strategy?
Thank you. This is a very pertinent question. And obviously, when we have impunity, the cycle of violence it remains. So tackling the issue of impunity is fundamental to improve the situation of safety of journalists, globally speaking. So first thing is, at the national level, we need to support for a more independent judiciary and a more independent prosecution services that are actually able to take specific cases against journalists as they deserve, as specific violations of human rights and press freedom. So in the case of UNESCO, for instance, we have established a global judges initiative that has already engaged 23,000 judges and prosecutors from all over the world, providing them with specific material. So it's basically strengthening rule of law in this area. But where we have the regional human rights systems, like in the case of the Inter-American region with the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, or the African region with the African Court of Human Rights and People's Rights, or the European system, these regional systems can also be supported when the national situation is not improving in facing impunity. So regional human rights courts can actually play a very important role. And as you have mentioned in the previous panel, the international courts like the International Criminal Court can also play this role. But that said, the other key element of the impunity issue is to keep underlining the importance of fighting impunity in the global arena, and particularly, again, supporting this very important relationship between rule of law and press freedom. This is absolutely fundamental when we are talking about ending the cycle of impunity.
Sustainable Development Goal SDG 16, and you know, we have seen some of the work that needs to be done in terms of the judiciary in that as well. And so I was very interested to hear about the possibility of Canada using our voluntary national review as an opportunity to highlight some of those challenges, or ways that Canada can help abroad as well. You also spoke about the gendered impacts and how we have seen this be gendered. That's very, very important, and I'd love you to give us more information about that, more detail that we can hear about the gendered impacts on violence against journalists and human rights defenders.
Sure. I mean, we have recently published a report called The Chilling, where we have analyzed a series of interviews with women journalists, a global survey worldwide, but also we did 2 case studies about the digital violence against Maria Ressa that was mentioned in the previous panel, and Carol Kaldawar. And we have been really seeing a specific trend to develop orchestrated attacks against women journalists worldwide, coming from hateful speech against these women journalists, but also more sophisticated attacks in terms of bots or doxing, or all those different words that we are now learning from this online environment of violence against journalists in general, but women journalists in particular. And here we do need to engage the internet platforms, the internet companies in this conversation, in a potential solution to this problem. One particular issue that's very, very crucial here is to demand more transparency of the internet platforms in the way they deal with these issues, but also relating to the data of violence against journalists and against women journalists in particular. if we want to produce evidence-based policy, for instance, to protect women journalists in the online environment, we need the evidence, we need the data. And unfortunately, we are not there yet. Those companies are very much obscure in the way they treat these data and the way they do their human rights risk assessment for dealing with this situation. So UNESCO reports have underlined first how dangerous the online environment is, particularly for women journalists, but also how difficult it is to design evidence-based policy, particularly because we lack transparency among these internet companies.
Much for that question, for that answer.
Thank you for that. Now we will go to the next round of questions. I'm afraid I have some bad news. We're going to have to restrict each time slot to 3 minutes. And we will be starting off with Ms. Vanderbilt.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And my question is for both witnesses. This committee in 2018 did a study on women human rights defenders and recommended that Canada be a place of safe haven when human rights defenders need to get out temporarily, maybe permanently, but very often it's just a very quick, immediate place of refuge. And then, of course, typically human rights defenders, journalists, and others want to return to continue the fight. And our government about a year ago implemented a human rights defenders refugee stream of 250 per year, and I can well imagine that journalists and others are part of that particular stream. Can you recommend what we can do? We're doing it through third parties. If there are ways that Canada could improve that process, could potentially make this scalable and make it a model for other countries as well. And it's either one that wants to go first. I'll start with Mr. Weimers.
Yes, thank you. I can't say that I'm especially familiar with that program in Canada, so I would have to look into it more. I'd be happy to get back to you. I can tell you that the needs of that sort of a program are only going to continue to grow as long as repressive regimes are allowed to get away with the level of impunity they have. Anecdotally, we know of just right now about 600 reporters who are just trying to get out of Russia because they're, fearful of persecution or arrest, or their organizations have shut down and they no longer have some of the protection they once had. And that's one of the things my organization is working to do right now, is helping facilitate safe passage into countries with lesser visa requirements from Russia, so that these reporters can get to a safe third country quickly.
Thank you. Mr. De Souza Godoy?
Yeah, thank you for the question. As Clayton mentioned, I don't know the particularities of the Canadian system, but definitely this is a very concrete measure that can help human rights defenders and also journalists. We saw with the situation, for instance, very recently in Afghanistan, but now in Ukraine, that we have a considerable amount of refugee journalists that need this kind of protection and shelter elsewhere. So we have been supporting through the UNESCO Global Media Defense Fund, which also counts with a strong financial support from Canada, which I thank you very much for that. We have been supporting a structure under the International Bar Association that's called the High Level Legal Panel. And this high-level legal panel that was co-chaired by Lord Neubar and Amal Clooney, they produced 2 years ago a very important report, particularly in these kind of issues, how to have a special visa regime, how to offer consulate assistance to journalists that are facing this kind of persecution in their countries, and so on and so forth. So I would recommend, if the committee has not seen those reports yet, that they really go into a very detailed approach on how different countries can improve their systems in helping these kind of journalists and human rights defenders that are in need of improved policies in that area.
You. If we could now turn to Mr. Cooper. You have 3 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My questions are for Mr. Weimers. In your testimony, you noted that in terms of press freedom and protecting journalists, that the international legal framework has improved, but yet at the same time, things are getting worse, not better, at least based upon Reporters Without Borders Press Freedom Index. You provided one recommendation, that being supporting a UN resolution to establish a special envoy to protect journalists, and you noted that in particular such an envoy would be important to address the issue of impunity. I was just wondering if you could maybe elaborate on that recommendation and also perhaps just address this issue of the legal framework being better than it was before, but yet at the same time things sliding backwards, and how such an envoy would make things any different.
Sure, and I should really preface my response here with the fact that I am not a lawyer. So you can take my legal analysis for what it's worth. What I probably should have said instead of the legal framework getting better is that the legal framework has been discussed and it has been codified in many ways, but it's not enforceable without a mechanism in place to do the enforcing. And by setting up a special envoy for the protection of journalists, that takes the next step from codification of the framework into actual enforcement. And it would create a nexus where the international community can converge in order to, start by monitoring the situation, make recommendations, working with, organizations like UNESCO and the Human Rights Commission, and then follow up with repercussions for bad actors on the international stage. But until we have that mechanism, this is just a framework that exists largely theoretically.
Right. And do you have any other recommendations that the Government of Canada could be taking?
Sure. So Guilherme also mentioned Canada's leadership in the Media Freedom Coalition, which we think is very important. Canada is also a participatory in the Forum for Information and Democracy. These are important international forums for like-minded democratic governments to be able to come together to really, set the expectations when it comes to protecting the free access of information internationally. And I'll just give you, you can go on and on here, and I'll give you one quick example here is repressive regimes enjoy this competitive advantage whereby, in an open democracy, their state media content is going to be allowed to be published freely. But the same is not true, say in China or in Saudi Arabia. So RSF has been working with the Forum on Information and Democracy, for example, to develop a reciprocity mechanism by which, say, the airwaves in Canada can only be used by a Canadian outlet by a Chinese outlet if the Chinese government allows their airwaves to also be used by Canadian media outlets. You set up this reciprocity to even the playing field and get rid of that competitive advantage that repressive regimes enjoy right now.
Thank you for that. Now we move to Mr. Trudel. You have 3 minutes, Mr. Trudel.
Thank you, Chair. I'll try to put my questions quickly. Mr. D'Souza, you published a report, UNESCO published a report
for this. Witnesses, again, our sincerest apologies for this latest technical problem, in particular to Mr. D'Souza Godoy, who is 5 hours ahead of us, as I was informed. So we will resume questions. Mr. Trudel, you have 3 minutes, sir. Yep.
Monsieur.
Mr. D'Souza, you published a report in March 2022, UNESCO did, which underscores the existential threat, and I quote, that social networks are now causing to journalism, an interesting issue. I think you say that over the last 5 years, public and advertising have migrated to the internet. Google, Meta, of course, Facebook, of course, really accounts for half the advertising revenue in the world right now. And, of course, print newspapers have lost advertising revenue. You also mentioned that in September 2022, more than 1 million inaccurate messages about the pandemic were sent on Twitter within 1 month. So it's quite clear from your report that Facebook, of course, is not a media outlet. It's a threat to the proper dissemination of real information. Could you tell us a bit more about this report of March 2022, the revenue issues, the global social network platforms, it being a threat to even democracy?
Thank you for the question. This report is the World Trends Report on Freedom of Expression and Media Development, and it analyzes every 4 years the situation of media freedom, media independence, and media pluralism worldwide. And therefore, these issues you just mentioned, the issue of sustainable and viable media, or how the internet environment is impacting freedom of expression positively or negatively, are an essential element of this World Trends Report that was just published this month of March. But basically, obviously, it's a very long report. What I want to underline very quickly is that it brought forward this idea that journalism and information are public goods. And in being public goods, they require a special protection of the international system and special policies at the national environment to really protect those public goods that are so essential for our democracies. So all the UNESCO 193 member states, including Canada, last November, approved in the UNESCO General Conference the Windhoek Plus 30 Declaration, who underlines this idea of information and journalism as a public good, and established 3 key areas. One, I already mentioned before, the transparency of the internet companies. This is fundamental to develop evidence-based policy in this area. The other is media viability. We can't live with media deserts. We can't live with zones of silence. This can actually impact a lot our democratic freedoms. And the third element that we haven't mentioned here so far is media and information literacy. It's very important to empower the citizens at all ages to deal with these phenomena like disinformation and misinformation or hate speech online or conspiracy theories. So this report of UNESCO has gone into details, not only in addressing the diagnosis, but also putting forward some key recommendations to all the relevant stakeholders in this area.
Merci, Monsieur de Souza.
Thank you, Mr. D'Souza.
Well, we now turn to Ms. McPherson. You have 3 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to ask a few questions, if I could, of Mr. Weimers from Canadian Protection for Journalists Without Borders. And I think one of the things that I've been reflecting on is we're talking a lot about international journalists and the impact on international journalists. And I know that we are the International Human Rights Subcommittee, but I do want to just bring forward the idea that Canadian journalists over the last several months have also been under attack, and how we protect our Canadian journalists, particularly when we look at things like, you know, social media that is spreading a lot of misinformation, disinformation about mainstream media, about mainstream reporters. You know, Canada also has a role to lead by example, and our journalists are under attack in this country. What can we do about that, and how can we use that as a framework to move forward around the world?
That is a great question. You know, Canada has a commendable culture of free press, and I think that's certainly reflected in Canada's ranking in the index. But that is not to say that there are not always ways to improve. Certainly, there have been, you know, isolated incidents where journalists say, whether they were covering the Freedom Convoy protest recently, or whether they were covering Indigenous protests in British Columbia late last year, where journalists have found themselves, blocked from doing their jobs by the authorities on the ground there. And that is something that RSF is always strongly against. When we're talking more in the global sense of how can we protect the profession of journalism, especially online, you know, one interesting project that RSF has been working on recently is called the Journalist Truth Initiative, which essentially establishes the metrics by which we can measure authentic journalism. You know, you would go to a store and buy a refrigerator, assuming that refrigerator is always going to comply with international standards, that it's going to be safe, that you can have it in your home. But there is really no equivalent of international standards for what we would consider authentic journalism. And that's what the JTI would seek to create. And it's a completely voluntary questionnaire, essentially, that media organizations can participate in to become certified that they are JTI certified. And
is there any country in the world that is legislating this?
No countries in the world are yet legislating it. What the exciting development would be that if, say, Canada wanted to use a metric system like the JTI in order to assess how its funding is going to be given out for public media. It could be used also by NGOs who are giving grants to smaller media organizations all around the world. And ultimately, it could be incorporated into the algorithms of digital platforms like Google and Facebook, so that they give a little more weight to authentic journalism and a little less weight to clickbait and fake news.
So that's very, very interesting to me. Thank you.
Thank you very much. At this juncture, allow me to thank our two panelists for their incredibly thoughtful and informative testimonies, and for answering questions from the members. We're very, very grateful. Now, if we could suspend for a couple of minutes to go in camera for committee business.
I think it is appropriate to do the election of vice chair in the full meeting, because normally we do our opening meetings like that. So if you wanted to do that, because I would love to hear a speech, maybe lengthy, from the nominee or nominees. If it's going to be a big contest, I think it would be very good to hear an appropriate. I'll just ask for an appropriate speech.
So you really want us to not go in camera?
I think we should do this in public, because I think it's kind of fun.
Absolutely. And do we have to? Can we dispense with the speech though, or
no.
you insist?
I said an appropriate speech.
Absolutely. So for the first item on our agenda, we will keep it public. And now I will turn to the clerk so she can take us through this process.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will now open the floor to nominations for the position of Vice Chair. Mr. Viersen.
I would like to nominate Mr. Michael Cooper for the position of Vice Chair.
It's been nominated by Mr. Viersen that Mr. Cooper be elected as Vice Chair of the subcommittee. Are there any further nominations? Is it the pleasure of the subcommittee to adopt the motion? Yes. I declare Mr. Cooper duly elected as Vice Chair of the subcommittee, and I will turn it back to you, Mr. Chair.
Congratulations, Mr. Cooper. Now, if we could turn to the second item, and if we could go in camera for this. If we could go to the second item, which is up. Yes, if we could suspend for approximately a minute.